another one of our opportunities to reflect on the significance of new housing, and really importantly for us, about how we engage with that across the various different disciplines with which we are involved. Really good to welcome Richard Blyth to speak tonight. Thank you, Richard, for coming and for standing in at last moment. Really sorry that Victoria was not able to be with us, but really pleased that you are able to be with us, and to have Bishop Graham Tomlin with us as well. I'll say a bit more when I come to introduce both of them. But as I say, really good to see you again. Those of you who've been to these before will be familiar with the format. We'll have some input, both in our address and some theological reflection, a bit of time for discussion, and then after a short break, after discussion in groups, some time together. And those of you who know me will know that absolutely key to me at the beginning of any meeting is to have some idea as to when the meeting is going to finish. And for those of you particularly concerned, to make sure that you are there for the Great British Bake Off and the final at 8 o'clock. I promise that you will be with at least 20 minutes in hand. So 20 to 8 is our final cut-off time for this evening. But before we begin, let's keep a moment of quiet and pray together. Come in this strange year towards the season of Advent, as we await God's presence in our communities, pitching the tent into the soil of our communities. And so we pray for our engagement with areas of new housing and with housing, that houses may become homes and homes may be built together as community in which all may live and flourish and have the life in all its fullness that we know in Christ, through whom we pray. Amen. Richard, really good to welcome you this evening. Thank you for being with us, and indeed thank you, as I said, for stepping in Victoria's absence. You'll have seen in the information that came out earlier today a little bit about Richard, including, I have to say, the most snazzy jacket, which I'm really slightly sorry that you're not wearing now, but I'm jealous of the jacket alone, Richard, and that tells us of your long and deep involvement in policy, practice, and research, and in housing. In a number of different contexts, both in this country and indeed in Africa as well. And as we respond to growth, so we look forward enormously to what you have to say. I think you're going to talk to us for around half an hour or so. Richard, over to you, and welcome and thank you.
Bear with me while I start the sharing, which always takes a little bit of a moment to get going. That should work, and hopefully you've now got a big screen that tells you that my name is Victoria Hills, which it isn't. But I'm been very adequately introduced, including the jacket, so I think we're good to go. So I work for the Royal Town Planning Institute, which is a membership organisation. I see one of my members in the audience. Hello, Mike, a colleague from a while back when we were both in Berkshire. We're also a charity and a learned society. And I suppose the part of it that I tend to deal with is the research and the policy part. So our Royal Charter is to do with improving the science and art of town planning, and that's something that we are doing very much with our policy and research work. As we know, this is a unique year, actually also a kind of unique year for both these two gentlemen who have effectively won two important electoral victories. But they are there because, on that screen, because it seems to be a common call, both from civil society and also from governments, that after this crisis, we will build back better. There are some lessons we can learn from the last crisis. The last crisis we really had of this kind was the global financial crisis of 2008. And unfortunately, across the world, perhaps a lot of not altogether sensible decisions were made at that point relating to clamping down on society's spending. So this was the period of austerity that you've all heard of. And I think we can agree that one of the consequences of that was reduction in people's resilience to deal with the current crisis. So you'll all be aware that if you map the susceptibility to COVID-19, there are close relationships between people living in very dense and unsatisfactory living conditions, people who have long pre-existing health difficulties. So, it's not a good time to be poor. It's not a good time to be unwell, because you start this year, if you like, very much on the back foot. So building back better is going to mean something around trying to avoid perhaps some of the mistakes of the past, and to really invest in the kind of things that are going to make society more resilient. And there's a lot going on. You know that the climate crisis is the crisis behind the current crisis, and it won't go away. California has seen yet another autumn of wildfires. I clocked that a hurricane now approaching Nicaragua is the most severe, or also one of the latest in the hurricane season, arising from very high sea surface temperatures in the South Atlantic. There is a big shortage, there's a big biodiversity crisis around the world, and there's also, as you know, a very serious problem about the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which is causing global warming. Not to mention, as it were, closer to home in terms of the atmosphere, big problems around the air we breathe and what it does to our health. There's only 30 years left to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to net zero, which is a UK government commitment. So what are the kind of things people have been asking for around the world, as what kind of shape should this recovery have? Well, definitely a sustainable recovery, a recovery in which existing buildings are retrofitted to reduce their carbon emissions through heating. A need to decarbonize transport to make the way we move around less dependent on fossil fuels, and eventually to be involving no fossil fuels at all. But also to encourage the continuing growth of active travel. So this is not a time to be thinking about retreating to your electric guitar, your electric car, because there are all sorts of difficulties in simply replacing petrol cars with electric cars, which we could perhaps discuss later in the evening. We need a resilient recovery, so making sure that our towns and cities and rural areas are resilient against flooding, which I think is a particularly English difficulty, and one which this diocese has seen very much more than its fair share, if you like, over the last 20 years. And then also we need an inclusive recovery. We need a recovery which is going to overcome some of these difficulties of starting this year with very different levels of resilience in different parts of the population. I do remember, I think it was in Gloucestershire at the time of the 2007 floods, the one story that really struck with me was the story of someone who was wheelchair bound. And as the water rose in their home, it gradually rose to waist level, then it rose to chin level. and then it receded. And can you imagine how terrifying it must be to be in a position where you can't move and you don't know whether you're going to be able to go on breathing because of flooding in your home? I switched to the RTPI's work program over very quickly at the sort of in the spring, in the first lockdown, to examine this question of what would the planning response to the multiple crises, the crisis of inequality, the crisis of public health, and the crisis of climate. This is a resource, I think, a link I could share with you if you're going to be contacting participants at the end of this. We did a research report called Plan the World We Need, which showed how actually this is the time to really put faith and resources into urban planning. The last time we did this on a big scale was dealing with the rebuilding after the Second World War. Some people have cast a lot of doubt on the decisions that were made after the Second World War in relation to planning. It's certainly a time to reinvest in planning, to also look possibly at the relationship between our cities, towns and counties and our central government. One of the things we've noticed around the world is that some of the countries with very strong local infrastructure, such as South Korea and Germany, have been able to undertake efficient responses to the virus, which have also perhaps been less catastrophic responses, less sort of nuclear responses, if you like, but more flexible responses based on a very swift and agile pinpointing of the virus and the people that might be affected to it. We do need better ways of measuring things. One of the fascinating things about this year has been the fact that everyone's got really into data. Data on, particularly on infection, but we need data on all sorts of things. We need data on homelessness, on the quality of our homes. We need data on things like, are we using too many fossil fuels when we heat our homes? We need data on things like, how are we traveling? There are all sorts of exciting ways to do that. And from those of you within the planning sector, the RTPI recently published an exciting new report on new ways to measure planning outcomes. Because across the UK nations, there's been a tendency to say that the efficiency of the planning system is determined by the number of planning permissions that are granted or the speed with which they're granted. And we would call for a much broader view of how you measure how well planning is doing. And finally, one of the things that we're looking for is data platforms. So I may be discussing a bit later on questions about a thing called the housing algorithm. One of the things that is quite useful to do is to create common platforms which can then be used as a basis for investment and software development by all sorts of small companies that need a standard, a thing called an API, which they can then share their technology with, so that you can then have, if you like, 100 flowers blooming in relation to developing technologies, not just for planning, but for some of the other measurements that we need to do. I suspect that many people in the room will have heard about the UK government's plans to reform planning in England. Their white paper was called Planning for the Future, published on the 6th of August. And another thing that my department had spent a lot of time dealing with was putting together the Royal Town Planning Institute's response to that planning reform proposal. We wrote a total of 60 pages of response, so I'm not going to unpick all of that this evening, but we did also boil that down into what we call the essay, which is more like 10 pages, and I can provide a link to that. One of the things you will have heard of is that the government is proposing what can be in shorthand described as zonal planning. That is, that local authorities will be directed to divide their territories into 3 different kinds of land: a growth area, a protected area, and a renewal area. This has caused quite a lot of controversy. My response, I know the RTBR response on that is I think that the growth idea is quite a good one. It's for a long time, local plans have disappointed people. They've disappointed residents because it sometimes seems like the high aspirations that are included in the local plan can end up, when you see the houses, as it were, coming out of the ground, at rather less than was expected. Promises made in terms of the appearance, the sustainability, the accessibility, the quality of new housing development don't seem to actually end up being delivered. And there are all sorts of reasons for that, which I haven't time to go into. But from the point of view of the developer community, also, local plans can disappoint because people will put a lot of effort into promoting a site through the local plan system. It involves an outlay of considerable sums of money and a lot of patience. And some of those allocations in local plans have been overturned by planning committees quite a lot later than the local plan was adopted. And so for that side of the equation, if you like, also, local plans are disappointed. They're not done what they said that they would do. So I think we need some kind of increasing certainty in relation to growth. The protected areas are a little bit of a disappointing concept. As you will all know, we need nature recovery to take place across our rural areas, some of which are in very poor conditions considering the level of the nature resource in those areas and the particularly people's access to the countryside. So we think that where it says protected areas, that needs to go beyond protected to be areas for nature improvement, and particularly at the moment, areas for nature improvement that are close to where people live. So yes, I celebrate the fact that we've got some excellent national parks in this country, and you in this area have got the Cotswolds area of outstanding natural beauty and the Forest of Dean. But many people do not live near places of great landscape value. So we really need to be saying that the priorities for nature improvement should be in some of those places which are the scrappy land adjoining our towns and cities, the areas of prairie farming, which have driven species to take refuge in the few remaining hedgerows and patches of woodland we have left. So protection needs to go much further than just protection. And one of the things that we call for, now that we've left the European Union, is for there to be created single environment improvement plans over some wide areas, such as, say, Gloucestershire, in which all the activities on nature improvement are focused together in a single strategy, which would include spending on biodiversity net gain, on environmental land management, payments to farmers, investment by water companies, air quality, a whole series of currently disparate plans inherited from the EU, which really should be drawn together into a single local environmental strategy, which could then be placed next to the planning strategy, and they could be aligned together. Public engagement is going to need quite a lot of reform if we're going to do this process, because the government's idea is that instead of having extensive engagement with the public at the planning application stage, that you move this, as they say, upstream into the local plan stage. This is quite a challenge because, as anyone involved in writing local plans will know, it's difficult to get the public interested in them. They tend to be abstract, they're documents full of lots of words. It's not clear how it relates to what's happening on your doorstep. And quite often the public only get involved when a planning application arrives, as it were, in their vicinity, and they suddenly get very interested in it and want to comment. So if we are to concentrate public engagement at the beginning of the local plan process, that will require very substantial investment. The RTBI called on the government's spending review, which we'll be hearing about tomorrow, to put resources into a national campaign that basically says planning is changing, rather like the Brexit campaign, to make everyone aware that if we're going to have this new kind of planning system, everyone needs to know about it. We've had 70 years of being used to a planning system where you engage at the end. that will need turning on its head, and people need to know about it. The government has put a lot of enthusiasm into a concept of digital planning. I think this is very exciting. So we've seen this year how the whole planning system has been transformed by meetings such as this one. The local planning authorities quickly went into being able to undertake virtual planning committees. The planning inspectorate has transformed itself into being able to hold virtual planning inquiries, and local planning inquiries, or local planning examinations, I should say, have been put online. And that has actually led to some very interesting spikes and increases in public engagement, which is a great opportunity, and one where I think we would not want to go back to the drafty town hall and the audience of 3 listening to a couple of barristers grandstanding in front of an inspector. So there are some exciting changes here, but we do feel that digital planning must follow a number of key commitments, such as we've made in our partnership with the Connected Places Catapult. For example, we need to make sure that we don't exclude as many people by moving to digital engagement as we possibly excluded in the past by relying on face-to-face engagement. So what happens if you're in an area with no broadband? What if you can't afford a laptop or a smartphone, so you can't be included in discussions around what your area is going to look like in the future? We must make sure that all parts of society can participate in digital planning engagement. The government has put a lot of focus on improving the quality of the design of new buildings. The government ran a commission called Building Better, Building Beautiful throughout last year, which came up with some very interesting recommendations at the end of it, most of which we would wholeheartedly endorse. We would stress, however, that the design of buildings goes much beyond what they look like, to include things like, are the rooms large enough? Do people have access to green space? Are rooms being heated, homes being heated by methods which are sustainable methods? What is going to be done about the phasing out of gas boilers? What is going to be done about insulation? And a designed home is a home where you can reach other facilities, such as being promoted in France as the 15-minute city or Scotland as the 20-minute city. So good design is important, but it's very wide-ranging. Finally, the government proposes to shake up the way in which developers contribute to infrastructure and affordable housing through a single infrastructure levy levied across all development at a fixed percentage rate across the whole of England. I think everyone would welcome a simplification of the current Section 106/ Community Infrastructure Levy system. It is the latest in a long 70 or more year crusade to find a way of satisfactorily resolving the issue of a betterment from the grant of planning permission. However, a single levy is going to be a very difficult thing to make work. Either you have to levy it at such a small percentage of the value of development that it doesn't really bring much money in, or you have to levy it at a high rate, which runs the risk that many parts of the country just can't afford to contribute to it at all. So we have parts of the country where even to build a new house costs more than you can sell them for. So where is the planning gain? Where is the uplift in land value in a situation like that? We have other parts of the country where the grant of planning permission leads to a 10 times or more increase in the value of a piece of land. So it's a difficult thing to make work as a national system. There are things missing from the government's reforms. One is an answer to the problem of how do you plan across areas more than a single local authority district. We have some ideas about how you might do that, which arise from some of the issues I was talking about earlier. So if you had a green growth board at a strategic level across a number of authorities, this board could oversee a whole series of important strategies which are needed within that territory. A public health strategy, very important at the moment, a local industrial strategy, how are we going to get out of a situation where so many people are dependent on the Chancellor of the Exchequer for their paychecks, a local environment improvement plan, as I mentioned, and also some kind of plan to deal with what is transport going to look like in the future. And then particularly important to many voters and many residents is what is the NHS going to do about keeping itself going through the next 10 years, dealing with all the demands on its facilities and on its staff in a situation where we are going to need to try and align NHS planning with all these other issues. So we would promote green growth boards. We think that a problem with the white paper is it doesn't appear to address anything to do with economic growth and the levelling up agenda, trying to bring all of England's regions up to the level of the best in terms of economic returns to their residents. We think that there's very little on climate action, and we certainly think as a minimum, a new planning system must carry forward our legal commitments on climate change which exist under the Climate Change Act. We also need to see, I think, a lot more on supporting local planning authorities in making decisions on climate. The National Planning Policy Framework, which is the government's rule book, if you like, for running the planning system, is quite weak on action on climate. And the Prime Minister committed the government last week to a 10-point plan on the environment. We really need to see that forming a kind of golden backbone in the National Planning Policy Framework so that you can refuse applications that don't tally, that don't deliver on net zero in the long term. And that will be a big change from the current situation where perhaps climate is only one of a number of quite varied considerations that local authorities make when they make decisions on planning applications. And finally, on climate, I think my point about the wheelchair and the flood is that actually the climate is very much a social justice issue. Many people, as a result of poverty, are in a worse position in being able to deal with climate than other people. And I think particularly perhaps in a Christian context, that's something to look very carefully at, the whole issue of climate justice. One worry that we have from the housing formula that the government has consulted on at the same time, pretty much as its white paper, is that in order to meet some very punishing targets, or some very ambitious targets for local authorities, particularly in southern England, there's a risk that local authorities will be forced to allocate a lot more housing land in remote locations in the countryside. I think perhaps a matter of great concern to you as a rural county. It's often easier to allocate land in the countryside for development because it's quite easy to get people to invest in countryside living, particularly, I think, following the COVID crisis. But this may not enable us to deliver on a lot of other outcome objectives, particularly around climate and around even things like loneliness. So remote housing estates are not great places to live, even if you have perhaps the opportunity to work from home. And a lot of people do not have that opportunity. They have jobs which require presence in the workplace. Remote locations are not good from this point of view. We studied this, we're the only organizations who've done so, and we found that up to about 2017, things weren't going too badly in terms of the way in which we locate our new housing, but it's on a kind of cliff edge, and any government policy which is very much pro-development at any price could tip those kind of figures you see in front of you over into much less sustainable patterns of development. anyone who's had to deal with the planning system from the point of view of making an application to it will know that the situation in terms of resources for local planning authorities is very serious. And we would estimate that there has been a sustained fall in resources available for planning departments, a particularly large fall in the resources available for writing local plans, which is the dark blue on this graph. And yet it's plan making, which seems to be the government's kind of great white hope, that we're going to put more effort into writing our plans and designing them well so that we don't need to spend a lot of time doing what used to be called development control, the determination of planning applications. Well, that's got to change if we're going to be able to write detailed and accessible local plans with a heavy digital input. One of the worrying things about the last 10 years has been that local planning departments have become increasingly dependent on the income from planning fees, and there's been less, if you like, core direct funding. That's a very serious problem, particularly because it means that the planning departments in the rich parts of the country are the ones that are most able to cope. And actually, we need planning to take place in areas where people don't want to make planning applications. We need planning to act proactively in some of the poor parts of the country where actually we need to take proactive action ahead of the application for planning permission so that we encourage people to come to those places and invest. And that's very difficult if you don't have any investors already. And finally, if you like, what's missing from the planning reform programme is a real link up across government departments. The document reads as if it was written by one ministry only, and I suspect that was very much the case. So I've hinted about some of the government's environmental ambitions, which are very respectable. It's very clear, following Michael Gove's legacy at environment, that this government is determined to make its mark in environment. We have the COP26, as it's called, the World Climate Summit in Glasgow next year. So the spotlight will be on the UK in climate terms, but it's very difficult to see any of that in the planning white paper. Equally, we have a Department for Transport committed to decarbonise English transport in the future to meet those net zero targets. Again, it's very difficult to see from the planning white paper what the role of the planning system will be to decarbonise transport. And yet we can see all sorts of opportunities for planning to play a big role, particularly in encouraging walking and cycling and the use of safe public transport. So it needs to be clear how the government's planning ministers see the planning system playing a part across the whole of government in a whole series of different areas of importance to all of us, and not just in producing planning permissions for housing, which seems to be a kind of particular focus of the planning white paper. Thank you very much for listening. I will stop sharing now, and I believe there's going to be the opportunity to discuss what I've said along with what Graham is going to say shortly at the panel discussion at the end and also in the breakout groups. Thank you.
Richard, thank you. Thank you so much. I think one of the purposes of these gatherings is that we can be informed, so we can be engaged. And I think you've really helped us to do that in what you've been saying about these developments in planning for the future, about what's good and where we need to be engaged to make it better. I love that phrase, planning the world we need in that. So that informing us to be engaged in that process to create that world that we need, to create the world that we believe those made in the image of God, the people of this world deserve to live well. Really grateful for that. As you say, we're going to have an opportunity to stop and reflect in a moment in smaller groups, but of course there are some deep theological questions in that as well about who we're called to be as a people. And tremendous tonight that we've got Bishop Graham Tomlin with us. Graham, you're chair of the Archbishop's, vice chair of the Archbishop's Canterbury's Commission on Housing, Church and Community. I know that housing is something really close to your heart, not least through your ministry in London and leading the church's response to the events in Glenfall, leading that in our response to all that's happened there. So we are really pleased that you're here and look forward to your reflection. Graham, to you.
Thank you, Robert. First rule of Zoom is to unmute yourself, and I've managed to do that successfully. And it's very good to see all of you today, and to be, if you like, virtually in Gloucester Diocese. I was actually born in Gloucestershire. I was actually born in Bristol, but just across the border into what certainly was Gloucestershire at the time. I'm never quite sure whether the borders have changed, but certainly a West Country boy, as I was thinking of myself, and it's very good to be with you tonight. I'm here to offer a few theological reflections on our theme tonight, particularly in relation to housing and the government white paper in particular. And just a word to begin with about the Archbishop of Canterbury's Housing Commission. Many of you may have come across his book that he wrote a number of years ago called Reimagining Britain, which Justin Welby wrote, Foundations for Hope. And in the book, there's a series of chapters on different aspects of our sort of common life together. And it deals with issues like family, education, health, housing, economics and finance and so on. And Archbishop Justin wanted to dig into some of these themes, and the first one he wanted to do was housing. And so he set up this commission, which began in April of last year. And so it's been running for around 18 months now. We were due to have reported in about October of this year, but because of COVID, we've had to postpone, and we're going to be reporting in February of next year. But the key idea behind the commission was simply that we need to build, or at least behind the chapter in the book, which was the kind of mandate we were given in the commission itself, was that we need to build not just houses, but communities. That's the crucial thing that we need to build. And what we've done over the last sort of 18 months or so is we've visited a number of areas of housing need across our nation, not as many as we'd like to have done, because for the last 8 months we've not really been able to travel very much, but we certainly tried to do much of that. We tried to listen to different parts of the country, asking bishops and churches around the country to kind of feed into us, listening to different dioceses and their approach to housing as well. And we've also tried to read the Bible again with the idea of housing in mind. And I guess one of the things that's come certainly to me as I've read the Bible is that in many ways you could understand the story of the Bible as a story of home and houses. It's the story of a home provided for the human race in the good creation, the Garden of Eden. Is then a story of how the human race becomes homeless, if you like, cast out of the garden as a result of their disobedience. There's then the long story of redemption that begins with the calling of Abraham and leads up through the history of Israel, with a lot of, incidentally, which we could go into later on, mention of houses, and there's their significance of shelter and housing and home during that story. But of course, then to the coming of Christ, the incarnation, the death and resurrection of Jesus. You then move on to the new creation, where God makes his home with us, the new Jerusalem coming down from heaven. So if you like, it's a story of home to home, home cast out of home and then coming back to home. In some ways, you could see the story of the prodigal son. It captures the whole story of the Bible in that way. And as we look at that whole grand story of salvation, the story of the Bible itself, I guess we've begun to discern in there a picture of what housing might look like. When you take 5 moments of that story, I want to just explore what those moments tell us about what housing might look like. So if you like, you have 5 moments of the story. The first moment in the story is the doctrine of creation. And the doctrine of creation tells us that the creation is good, and that therefore a housing policy that speaks of the goodness of creation will be sustainable. Housing that is in harmony with the goodness of the world that God has made needs to work with the grain of creation, not against it, to preserve it, to nurture it, so it's properly sustainable for the past and the future. Second moment of the story, of course, is the story of the fall, the casting out of humanity into the the homeless wastes of the world. And the fall is a story that tells us that unaided, if we do not intervene in some way, everything in this world tends to turn to decay, including our homes and our houses. If we are not careful about one another and about the built environment in which we live, the houses we live in can become dangerous, they can become unsafe. And therefore, one of the values that comes out for us out of the story of this story, particularly this moment in the story, is the fundamental need to prioritize safety in our housing. That is something that clearly was not the case going on in Grenfell, as we've seen in the public inquiry in recent times. Third moment of the story, of course, is the story of redemption. And right at the heart of redemption is the doctrine of the incarnation, where in that message translation of John chapter 1 verse 14, the word became flesh and blood and moved into the neighborhood. Bishop Robert mentioned it in his prayer at the beginning, that idea of God pitching his tent amongst us. And that idea of God making his home amongst us in Nazareth and Jerusalem and Capernaum and so on tells us something about our need for stable housing. Housing which enables us to put down roots in a community, to feel we belong in a place. The fourth moment of the story is the story of the church, the coming of the church, this new community where all the normal walls that divide humanity are broken down. And therefore, housing that reflects this part of the story is going to be sociable housing. It's going to be the kind of housing that enables communities to be built, where the boundaries we place between different houses are in a way porous, that enable people to exercise hospitality to one another, where there is communal space. And then the final part of the story is, of course, the new creation. The new creation, which when we read of that in the book of Revelation, it's a place of incredible beauty and delight. And therefore, housing that reflects this part of the story will be deeply satisfying. It will be a place we delight in coming home to, we enjoy living in because of its beauty, or because of the pleasure it gives us, and its harmony with the wider world and so on. So what we're saying in this is that the story of the gospel gives us these 5 crucial values that make a Christian vision of housing: that it is sustainable, that it's safe, that it's stable, it's sociable, and it's satisfying. And we're saying that this is a vision of what good looks like in housing. In actual fact, it echoes a lot of what we heard when we visited areas of housing need. People saying, well, actually, we are living in housing that is not safe, that is not stable, that doesn't actually create community, that is not a good place to live in, that isn't sustainable. And we're saying that housing that is like this, if you like, tells the story of the gospel in bricks and mortar. That's what it is, and that's what it does. Now, in offering that framework of thinking, these 5 core values that for us emerge both from our understanding of the story of Scripture, but also from our listening to the poor in the area of housing, that, if you like, gives us a big framework. Many different interest groups in the area of housing focus on one or the other of these, whether safety or beauty or community, whatever else it is. This is, if you like, a big picture given to us by the big picture of Scripture that gives us a picture of what housing needs to look like if it's to reflect God's will for us as a human race. Now, just lastly, just a few comments. When we measure the government white paper against these, maybe there's a few questions we might want to ask. And that echo some of the things that Richard's always been saying. To build communities, we need stability and we need sociability. Housing needs to be stable, places where people can put down roots, because you commit to an area where you're going to be living long term. If you're there for 6 months and you've got to move on because the rent gets too high, you're not going to commit to that kind of community. If the building is not such that it enables you to have interaction with your neighbours, you're not going to have sociability. Equally, when housing is out of reach of people, either because of an unstable rental market or too much of people's income is going on paying rent or mortgage repayments or whatever, it builds instability into the system. And therefore, one of the things we want to emphasise on the Housing Commission is that we need to build not just more houses, but we need to build more affordable houses. And that is going to be crucial for us, that we build houses that are within the reach of people to enable them to put down roots to belong in a place. And we've done sort of analysis of it, that very often building more homes, this is the story of the last 20 years, building more homes often means they are simply bought up by those who already own homes already, as with buy-to-let mortgages and everything else. And one of the questions I think we have for the government white paper is, will this deliver more affordable homes? Not very clear that it will do that. The government, the white paper says that it will deliver at least as many as at the moment, but we're saying actually we need a lot more than we have at the moment. And especially if particular moves, like it's saying that small sites of less than 50 dwellings are now exempt from providing any affordable housing, is that actually going to reduce the number of affordable housing? So there's a question mark. Second question, to build community with the earth or wider creation needs proper attention to sustainability. Housing that reflects this part of the gospel story will be properly sustainable. And I think, as Richard's pointed out already in his piece, there's not a lot about that in the white paper, about our need to radically retrofit our homes, build new ones that are properly sustainable into the future. And I guess the third question is one about the quality of build. Again, there have been some fears that if this is a kind of deregulation of the planning exercise, will it lead to housing that is poor quality? What is there in there about the safety of houses? What kind of homes? Will they build community? We don't really know. There's not much about that in the government white paper. And that's a question we might want to ask in the light of our framework of understanding housing. And then one last point, because there's one other part of the gospel story, which I think is a very important part of this narrative. At the heart of the gospel story is sacrifice. The self-giving sacrifice of Christ on the cross, through which redemption is won. In Christian faith, life comes through death, not without it. Resurrection comes through the cross. In order to get the kind of housing we need, it will involve sacrifice. Now, at the moment, the cost of bad housing is paid by certain people, by the poor, those who are at the receiving end of the housing crisis, those who are living in unstable, unsafe properties where far too much of their income is going on rent or mortgage repayments. And if sacrifice is at the heart of the Christian faith, to solve our housing crisis, there will need to be sacrifices from all of us, whether that's the sacrifice of refusing to be a NIMBY and allowing housing to be built in our backyard, which we may not choose to have, whether it's the sacrifice of developers receiving less profit than they would otherwise get, or whether it's landlords receiving a lower rental to make it within reach of people in a local area. If we're going to solve the housing crisis, there's going to be an element of sacrifice that has to be shared across our society, including by us as the church as well. And I guess one of the final question is, where is that built in to our vision of solving our housing crisis? Is there really a sense of every single part of the housing system bearing some of the cost of fixing this housing crisis in our nation, which is affecting so many? So there is a framework, there's some questions, and hopefully we can discuss some of those a little bit later on when we get around to the discussion.
Graham, thank you so much. I think that there's a richness in that and a connection between that framework and all that we've been hearing before. You've all been very patient and listened, but there's been a great deal in that to hear. We've got an opportunity to reflect now for 10-12 minutes or so till about 7 o'clock. I think it would be really good in the small groups that we'll be in just to reflect on what have you heard, what's the most important thing that struck you within that, and what are the connections that we're making between what we've heard there from Richard and from Bishop Graham. And then what's that saying? What's it saying to the churches, to the other organizations that we represent here? And then what do we want to be saying to government, to planners, to our wider society about the kind of society we want to build in our attitude to housing? Just use this to really challenge us, both in what it's saying to us and in what we might be wanting to say to others as we seek to respond to this challenge of planning for the future. So we'll do that for a few minutes. We'll then come back and have a short comfort break and before we have some time together, both to share what we've been talking about and to hear responses, particularly from Richard and Graham to that. So Catherine, if you could do that wonderful magic of Zoom and send us into groups. I think those who've been speaking, you're welcome to go into groups or just not to join, in which case you'll come back to the middle and we will see you shortly.
Excuse me 2 seconds. There's a slight problem with the breakout room. Let me just reassign them.
Welcome back, everybody. That's great. Hopefully coming in. All right, welcome back. Thank you. Let's assume most people are there. I've just been part of a great conversation which really been challenged about some of the things that the church might be needing to do indeed. Let's just take a 5-minute break. So if we come back at about 9 minutes past, just a 5-minute kind of stand up and turn around break before we do our last half an hour. Then we'll be back. While we're doing that, just think about what are the things that that you'd like to comment on, and then we'll come back to our contributors and to Chris as well, who works with us in the diocese, to reflect on that. Please don't go away, but you may want to turn your camera off and put yourself on mute. And 9 minutes past, 10 minutes past now.
% affordable housing. I mean, that's affordable, let alone social housing, and affordable is not very affordable anyway, because otherwise it wouldn't guarantee the right sort of profit. 20% was the figure, I think, that's most frequently commented. So to the developers. So where is the idea of sacrifice for developers who are expected to earn that sort of money? That's the issue.
Nigel, thank you. And at the end of that, you've linked up, as I was about to do, that question of sacrifice and social housing, and it goes back to something that Chris was saying about sustainability. Richard, I wondered if you'd like to come back on those things, and maybe there's anything from Graham that you want to pick up on as well.
I'm a little bit of a pushback on this question of blinking first, because actually one of the real problems of the current system is that we operate on a blinking first, or I call it a game of chicken, in which because we do negotiate the contributions from developers on a case-by-case basis, as the courts tell us we must do at the moment, one of the big difficulties is that we wait for someone to blink. And the consequence of this is that the process of agreeing a Section 106 agreement for developer contributions can take years to reach a conclusion, because everybody is in an entrenched position. So I have some sympathy with the government saying, well, actually, can we strip out this very expensive, often expensive lawyers involved in a kind of effectively prolonged version of what happens if you get into a long negotiation about a house purchase, that no one has to move at all, into a simpler system where actually the rules are agreed at a higher level, and there isn't a question of having to blink first because we've made the rules very clear. But I would agree that at the highest political level, there would then need to be a commitment to, I think one very useful thing would be for a government of any persuasion to decide just what its ambitions are. So I have a lot of sympathy with the view that many people over the years have wanted to own their own home. And to say, well, we should just build lots of social housing for everybody can seem like somehow to frustrate the ambitions. And often that is a statement made by people who already own a home. So we have to be quite careful to say, we will have lots of social housing and no more housing for people to buy. But on the other hand, we do need some sensible economic modelling on this, because it's getting harder and harder to buy homes. So we can't assume that even if the dial is shifted perhaps back to where it was even as recently as 2005, that still leaves a lot of people, even in the very best of possible scenarios, not able to buy, certainly not able to buy outright. So we do need a strategy that says this is what we're going to do about those that can afford to buy, those that can't, and those that can afford to buy a share. And there's no clarity at all about that strategy. All we have is a fairly generous but also inadequate social housing building program. On the question of the sort of how does this work with the new white paper, a suggestion that I think councils and residents and voters might want to make to the minister is, should the new system of identifying zones have a zone which is an affordable housing zone? So instead of all this argument about, is it 20%, is it 30%, is it 10%, is it 0%, just simply get the local plan to say this is going to be an area where we have affordable housing. We need to make sure that's not a ghetto. And there's been some very poor examples in the past of, but they were phenomenal council estates, council estates with 70,000 people on them. I think it'd be quite within, particularly, within an area of fairly small towns and villages, for the local plan simply to say, we are going to build 1,000 affordable homes here, and they're going to vary in terms of tenure. They're all going to look good, and that is the zone we're going to make, and that is what will happen. So I think that will be a way in which you could use the zoning proposals for a greater good.
Richard, thank you. Bishop Graham, I wonder if I might come to you to reflect both from your context and into Gloucestershire. I think there is that sense that Gloucestershire is, there's much of Gloucestershire which is rural, but there are nonetheless, I think, some significant areas of social need and social housing requirement in Gloucester. So this remains very much a live issue, and so in the rural context as well, where poverty is so often hidden. Bishop Graham.
Yeah, thank you, Robert. I mean, just to comment on some of those points there. And the who blinks first question is a really interesting one, I think, and because the problem is usually whoever blinks first is the weakest in the chain. Example being the cladding issue at the moment. We've got this standoff between who's going to pay for the price of remediation of flammable cladding on buildings across the country, and there's a kind of standoff between the developers of the building and the government. No one's going to sort of pay first, so who ends up getting the bill? It's the leaseholders. And we've got a number of cases around the country of leaseholders have suddenly been saddled with bills of £50,000 or more to remediate cladding that they had no responsibility at all for putting up. And so the who blinks first question often ends up with the poor and the weakest. And I suppose in my answer to that, who blinks first is, well, I kind of think I have to blink first if I'm serious about this, and I have to think about what is my particular kind of role within the housing industry. So, for example, my wife and I, we own a flat, and during the COVID crisis, we were aware that the tenants in our flat were really struggling. They'd been furloughed from work. They were on a kind of lower income, and they were really struggling to pay the bills. And so we just decided we would reduce the rent voluntarily over that time to enable them to stay in the flat, and that meant we were getting less rent than we could have got sort of by rights. And that's not to blow our own trumpet at all, but it seems to be just a tiny example of, okay, what can I do in the particular role I play in the housing world to begin to move towards a different thing. I think there's a question about the church. One of the things we would like to be able to say as a housing commission is that as a church, we, if you like, blink first, that as the church commissioners, as diocese, we make some sacrifices in terms of the way we use our land and the kind of the income we can get from it. So I think those are some observations on that. I mean, there's a really interesting comment further down here about much of what we said this evening is based on Christian values. Is this a pipe dream to extend beyond that? And I suppose my comment on that is that the 5 values that we've identified, our hope is that, yes, that they are rooted in Christian theology. They're rooted in our Christian story, in the great narrative of the Bible. But hopefully they are also qualities that you don't have to be a Christian to acknowledge that those 5 things actually make up a picture of good housing. that housing needs to be sustainable, it needs to be safe, it needs to be stable, it needs to be sociable, and it needs to be satisfying. Now, you don't have to be a Christian, you don't have to buy into the theological framework to kind of acknowledge that as a potentially a picture of what good housing looks like. And one of the things we're in the process of doing at the moment is talking to a number of different organizations just to say, you know, is this something you could endorse as a kind of picture of what good housing looks like? So if we could agree on that, then it gives us a bit of a framework, a set of criteria to be able to weigh things like government white papers or housing developments or properties, both at the very local level, whether you're a church looking at a housing development that's happening in your local parish, you're thinking, okay, is this a good housing development? Well, does it accord with those 5 qualities, those 5 things? Or whether it's a sort of, you know, on a sort of city or a council level or on a national level as well. So that's my sort of thoughts on that.
Graham, thank you. Thank you so much for that. And like you, I was really grateful for Alistair's question and really wanting to respond to that in terms of a sense, kind of a real challenge, and not just for the church, but to all of us who are passionate about this, to change the narrative and to change the boundaries of the way in which we do planning and the way in which we build communities, and say, actually, this story, we're not going to stick with this story. It needs to be different. I wonder if I might bring in Benjamin Priest-Smith, who's our Diocesan Secretary. Diocesan Secretaries are wonderful people who look after the organisation of the church. Ben, would you be willing to comment on this from that perspective?
So from our diocesan perspective and building and what we seek to do in building community.
Yeah, I think it might be helpful.
And so as a diocese, we, a lot of you will know, we have a series of ancient land that we have available for development. And that's a question for us that in my job is a regular issue. And we're faced with real choices in development about what we do. We are absolutely committed to community. We're absolutely tied by charitable law about what we can do with it. And we have to find a balancing act. And I think that's the biggest challenge for us as a church as we seek to get more involved in this, is we need to know there is no perfect answer to this. There is no perfect development. There is no perfect community. There is no way of satisfying all voices in the room. And that's really challenging to much of the culture of the church. I think as a church, the biggest question we have to ask is, what do we really want from our engagement with development? What is our core purpose that we're seeking to achieve? Because otherwise, and I think Tom was right to challenge us in the small group we were in, is as a church, we want everything and we can't have everything. And so we have to ask ourselves the question, what are we really seeking to achieve by engaging more in development, both with our land and with our campaigning? What are we seeking to achieve? Are we seeking housing justice? Is that the same as, are we seeking better communities? Is that the same as saying we want more beautiful landscapes? What is it we're seeking to achieve? Now, as a diocese, that's a kind of practical question with us. And after the last conversation we have, I think there's a deeper conversation with us about some developments we have in train. But we need to know there's a cost to that. And there's the cost again on sacrifice. So the model, the traditional model, which was rightly challenged by Charlie and others last time around, is, you know, there's the kind of the get rich quick scheme of land ownership, which, to be fair, as a diocese, we've benefited from. You know, we sell off our land to developers and we receive a capital payment for that. That doesn't go, sadly, to pay for Barbadian holidays for the Diocesan Secretary. That kind of all gets reinvested in the Church of England. It's restricted to stipends, as many will know. If we don't do that, we will have less money to support the model of church we currently have. So we need to know that's a sacrifice. It might be a sacrifice we're willing to take, but we need to accept that. And I think it's quite an important moment for the church with the Housing Commission and with the challenges we're hearing here and we hear elsewhere. Are we so wedded to our assets and our wealth and our need to sustain the existing model of church, because that's what that means. It's not about being rich and having rich people somewhere mystically wandering off with bottles of cash. It's about sustaining the current model of ministry. Or are we willing to put our money where our mouth is and make sacrifices to build better communities? And I think that's a really good challenge. I'm up for whatever the church decides, because that's my job, but I hope we make the right choice.
Ben, thank you. It's been a real kind of good question. I agree with you, Mark. Well summed up. And that sense about what is best value in this, and the number of different responses to that, but some clearly Christian and theological responses about what's best value. We're running close against the clock. Rob Patchett, Rob Garnham. Sorry, you've made a number of comments, Rob, on the in the chat. Let me come to you briefly, give you the floor for a minute or so, and then I'm going to land this. So, Rob Garnham, unmute, and the floor is yours for a moment.
Okay, thank you, Bishop Robert. The first comment I made is when we come up with the ideas, the ethos, the values that we have, and how can we get local planning authorities to listen and to accept them and to think differently, because they are under so much pressure, so few resources, and yet it's the local planning authorities that can deliver this. Private firms might be able to deliver things on behalf of clients, but I think it's a local government who can deliver planning as a whole. And that got me thinking, as Ben was talking, we have lots of planning policies, we have a planning white paper. What is the vision that we're trying to achieve? Planning is about improving our lives, improving the social aspects of our communities. It's not just about putting up houses or sheds for factories. It is the whole. Planning should be the whole, and that needs to be expressed either by the government or even individual councils. They have a council plan, and they forget to relate that to their policy documents. The two need to come together, but people need to be stronger, I think, in articulating the vision that they want planning to achieve.
Rob, thank you for that challenge, and thank you for what's been a fascinating conversation tonight. I'm going to give three people a kind of last sentence each. Chris, let me come to you first. Chris, you've been working with us in the diocese for a number of years now, 2-3 years, and it's down to you in bringing a wide assortment of people together. And I'm really grateful for what you're doing and the networks that you are building with us. As you hear the conversation today, let me challenge you to do this in 2 sentences. I might allow you 3. What's your response to what you've heard? And then Bishop Graham, I'll come to you, and then Richard to you.
My response in 1 sentence is, we are being called by tonight's Zoom, we the church, to be in the forefront of creating social change which produces true justice and also proper environmental consideration as homes are built and as we use the resources that we have, our land, our assets, our buildings, etc.
Chris, thank you. Bishop Graham, I'm going to come to you for your 1 sentence, but I'm going to put a question in front of that as well, so I'll allow you a couple of extra sentences. You've heard what Chris has said. What would you say to those who would say that call is impossible to answer?
I would say we believe in a God who does impossible things. It seems to me that what this question about vision is crucial. And Sim has made a really interesting comment there about the long-term vision and the lack of that. And I sense that in a lot of what government says. And I guess what we see in the gospel, and I think this is in some ways the 1 sentence thing I want to say, is how do we bear witness to the gospel in the world of housing? That's my kind of primary question. How do we bear witness to the gospel of Jesus Christ in the world of housing? What does housing look like that echoes that gospel? And I think what we're offering here is a framework that does exactly that, a big vision for what good housing looks like, which I don't really see government really has at the moment. And I think we have that in the gospel. We have a big vision of what good housing looks like that enables us to be able to offer that to those outside the church as well as inside the church.
Thank you. And I guess one of the great challenges for government and ultimately for us as citizens within that is that we have governments which so often take just those short-term goals And it's how do we as a society say, actually, we want and will support a government which is prepared to invest and take those longer term involved, even if that involves that sacrifice that we need to make for that vision of what we believe our society should be. Richard, let me come to you. You've been our keynote speaker, so I will definitely give you more than one sentence. But as we come to the end of this, what are the things that you would like to say?
Well, a good thing about the last 6, well, maybe it's really 3 months, isn't it, is that debates about planning have spilled out from the narrow world that I work and live in to everybody. The government consultation closed at the end of October, but this is the beginning of a very long discussion that could possibly result in a planning bill being announced in the Queen's speech in May 2021. So this is not by any means a closed debate. And one of the things that we've seen through the virus is quite a big debate, particularly centered around the northern cities, but I see no reason why all parts of the country couldn't join in this debate as to what exactly is the role of central government and what is the role of local government. And actually the planning system is a very big battleground. So someone was saying, why can't we have visionary local plans? Well, one reason is that what can go in a local plan is very severely constrained by what the ministry says can go in a local plan. There are parts of the world where that's not the case. I mean, the President of the United States cannot decide if a skyscraper can be built in Oklahoma City or not. That's purely a matter for either a state or a city. So we have a very centralized system. One of the questions I think the people, the people need to think about is, do you want to have such a centralized system? That is certainly something there's been quite a lot of debate about. But at the same time, if you don't have a centralized system, there will be a price to pay. We've been hearing about sacrifice. So I remember, going back to the flooding question, that someone at an event I was speaking at in Leeds said, it's not fair that Gloucestershire gets so much money spent on flood defence. We have a great deal of need for flood defence in Leeds. But if we actually gave local government more power, you would not be able to make that statement because you would have your own money and you would have to spend it as you please. And actually that is, it's very much a case of be careful what you wish for. Then an area like this one would have to choose between primary schools and social housing, or between flood defence and environmental improvement. So we've got very used to a situation where those decisions are made for us by ministers on our behalf. If you really want visions for local areas, that would come at quite a high price in terms of people having to take those decisions into their own hands and deal with the consequences of them, these are very difficult choices to make. So I would encourage everyone to, take advantage of this 6 to 9 month window where these issues are being unfrozen, probably for the biggest extent since the Second World War. So a great opportunity for that debate. Please jump in. You have MPs, you have local councils, you have all sorts of people that can represent you, and civil society, different charities and National Trust, all working and looking at things. So please jump into this debate and contribute and work out what you want based on the values that you hold dear.
Richard, thank you, and thank you for reminding us of that opportunity. One of the reasons that we have these gatherings is that they do allow us to be informed, and I'm really grateful to you and to Bishop Graham for your input this evening and for informing us and challenging us and giving us a framework with which to do our thinking theologically and as we engage with our communities. And we're informed so that we can be engaged. And I come back to that lovely phrase about engaged in planning for the world that we need, the world as I believe that it was created to be. and as we would have it be, as God would have it be, all those themes, Bishop Graham, that you were talking about, and so we can be engaged in that process and in that conversation. And you've given us so much for that, and I think all of us here are really grateful. And if we were meeting in a proper room, we would give you a round of applause, but we give you a virtual round of applause and say to both of you, thank you very much indeed for being with us this evening. We're already been talking about these events for next year. We're looking at putting 3 of these on next year, slightly more evenly spaced than this one and the last one. The second one, I think it says January. I think it's more likely to be February. And Chris and Catherine and I have been talking and reflecting on that. We'll be sending you details of that. And then one about every 4 months or so, just to continue that sense of enabling us to be informed and engaged. But otherwise, I say thank you for being with us, and I wish you a really good rest of this evening. Thank you very much indeed.